So Prince William just physically stopped King Charles from signing away, one of the Crown's most important official residences, to Queen Camilla behind closed doors. And the absolute second William put his hand over that unsigned document, he triggered a constitutional showdown that forced the entire royal family to take sides. And honestly, the reason this got so intense isn't just about who gets the keys to a grand mansion. It's about a secret promise the late Queen left behind that Charles never saw coming. Before we get into the exact receipts and that sealed royal memo, hit subscribe real quick to Crown Watch so you never miss what really goes down inside the palace. Alright, let's start with what actually happened in that private office, because how William shut this down is wild. So it all kicked off at approximately 4:15 on a Thursday afternoon inside the King's private study at Buckingham Palace. King Charles was sitting behind a massive polished mahogany desk with a dark leather-bound folder resting open in front of him. Inside that folder was an executive transfer order, a document designed to grant Queen Camilla permanent unconditional personal control over a designated Crown official residence, complete with guaranteed lifetime maintenance, private security, and dedicated staffing. Charles held his favourite fountain pen in hand, entirely prepared to put ink to paper and seal an arrangement he had been privately planning for months. He had assumed that as sovereign, his executive authority over royal properties was absolute, and that this quiet signing would pass without a single ripple of resistance. But before that pen could even touch the page, the heavy double doors of the study opened and Prince William walked into the room. He didn't bring a team of courtiers with him, and he didn't raise his voice. He walked straight up to the King's desk, looked his father directly in the eye, and calmly placed his right hand flat over the signature line of the document. The silence that followed in that room was described by palace staff nearby as completely suffocating. Charles froze, staring down at his son's hand, resting over the unsigned paper, his face turning pale with absolute disbelief. For a moment, the reigning monarch of the United Kingdom sat entirely paralysed, stunned that his own son and heir apparent would have the audacity to physically block a royal decree. Charles looked up and asked a single quiet question. "William, what do you think you are doing?" And William's answer was completely direct. He basically told his father that no official Crown residence was ever going to be handed over as private property without a formal binding vote from the Royal Estates Council. He didn't ask for permission, and he didn't offer a polite diplomatic suggestion. He simply made it clear that the signing was stopped right then and there. And while that tense confrontation was unfolding inside the study, Queen Camilla was walking through a nearby corridor with a senior interior design consultant. She was literally going over preliminary floor plans, discussing structural refits, room layouts, and private garden redesigns for the very residence Charles was trying to give her. In her mind, the property was already hers. She had spent weeks planning how the household would run and who would be appointed to manage the grounds. Then a frantic senior aide stepped into the hallway, leaned in, and delivered a single, whispered message. "Your Majesty, Prince William has entered the King's study. He has blocked the authorization." People who were in the corridor reported that Camilla stopped dead in her tracks. The easy smile completely vanished from her face. She dismissed the interior decorator, with a brief gesture walked briskly into her private sitting room, and shut the heavy wooden door behind her, without saying a single word. The sense of total humiliation landed long before the anger did. She realised in that exact second that her position inside the palace was far more fragile than she had allowed herself to believe. William hadn't just walked into that room with emotional anger. He had brought a 4-page constitutional briefing drafted by Sir Julian Martin at Farrer & Company, the Crown's senior legal firm. The briefing laid out in plain, unyielding language that an official Crown residence could not legally or financially be converted into a private personal asset, while its security, structural upkeep and staffing costs remained permanently tied to public Crown funding. William wasn't just objecting as a son, watching a family disagreement over a house. He was stepping in as the future king, protecting the financial and institutional boundaries of the monarchy before a disastrous precedent could be set in stone. And what William was preparing to reveal next, a secret document kept hidden for years, was about to turn a tense family argument into a full-scale constitutional crisis. Now, before we go any further into the massive argument that broke out inside the palace that afternoon, we need to pause and break down why this property transfer actually matters so much. Most viewers see stories about royal houses and think it's just rich people arguing over real estate. But when you understand the plain English mechanics of how royal property works, you realise that what Charles was trying to do was an institutional disaster waiting to happen. Inside the British royal estate, system properties are strictly divided into two completely different categories. On one side, you have private sovereign estates like Balmoral Castle in Scotland and Sandringham House in Norfolk. These are private family properties. The sovereign owns them personally, pays for them privately, and can leave them to whoever they want in a will, without asking for permission from anyone. If Charles wanted to give Camilla a private cottage on the Sandringham estate, nobody could stop him. But on the other side, you have official crown residences, places like Royal Lodge, Clarence House, and official suites within Windsor Castle. These buildings do not belong to Charles as a private citizen. They belong to the Crown as an institution. They are supported through taxpayer-funded sovereign grant allocations, which pay millions of pounds every single year for private security perimeters, state maintenance, ceremonial staff, and structural repairs. They exist exclusively to support the official working duties of the reigning monarch and the direct line of succession. And that detail, that exact distinction, is where Charles's plan completely fell apart. What Charles was attempting to execute was a backroom administrative deal that would grant Queen Camilla permanent lifetime personal control over a major Crown official residence. That meant even if Charles passed away and Camilla retired completely from public life, she would retain exclusive private control of a massive Crown asset for the rest of her life. And even worse, the legal paperwork Charles was trying to sign would force future reigns, meaning Prince William's future reign, to keep paying millions of pounds annually out of official Crown funds to maintain, secure and staff Camilla's private residence indefinitely. Think about what that actually means for a second. Charles was trying to use public Crown property to fulfill a private marital comfort promised to his wife, and he was setting up a financial framework that would force his own son to foot the bill for decades after Charles was gone. And William understood the danger of that precedent completely. Days before the confrontation in the study took place, Catherine, Princess of Wales, had sat down with William at Kensington Palace to review the draft paperwork that had been quietly leaked to them by estate administrators. Catherine had looked at her husband and delivered a piece of advice that stayed with him when he walked into Buckingham Palace that afternoon. She told William directly, "If you remain silent right now, just to avoid a temporary family argument, your silence becomes legal consent the moment his pen touches that paper. And once that boundary is broken, you will spend your entire reign trying to fix it." Catherine's words reframed the entire conflict for William. Challenging his father wasn't an act of personal disrespect or family defiance. It was a mandatory duty to protect the future of the Crown. If a reigning monarch could quietly hand off official Crown property to solve a private domestic worry, then every single boundary governing royal wealth would begin to dissolve. Charles saw his actions as a noble act of generosity toward the woman he loved. William saw it as a reckless misuse of institutional power that would saddle the next generation with an impossible burden. And to make matters even more explosive, Charles was trying to push this deal through while actively ignoring a direct written command left behind by his own mother, Queen Elizabeth II. To really understand why William was able to step into that study and stop the King's pen without flinching, you have to go back several years to a private evening at Windsor Castle that almost nobody in the public knows about. This is where the emotional engine of this entire story actually began. It was during the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. The family had gathered for a private dinner in the formal dining rooms at Windsor. The atmosphere was polite on the surface, but during the main course, Camilla casually brought up a proposal regarding her future housing arrangements. She spoke about the necessity of establishing a permanent standalone private establishment at one of the official Crown properties, a place that would remain hers exclusively, regardless of future changes in the royal hierarchy. Charles had responded immediately, assuring Camilla in front of everyone at the table that the moment executive authority became his, he would make sure that exact property was permanently secured for her. People who were in the room that night noted that Queen Elizabeth did not engage in an argument. She placed her wine glass down on the table, looked directly at her son with a cold, measured gaze, and brought the dinner to an abrupt end before anyone could say another word. Later that same night, long after the dinner guests had departed, Queen Elizabeth summoned her daughter Princess Anne to her private sitting room. There were no courtiers present, no private secretaries, and no official recorders. But the late Queen spoke to Anne with absolute clarity about what had just transpired at the dinner table. The Queen explained to Anne that official Crown residences were created to serve the office of the sovereign, not to act as financial compensation or personal rewards for private emotional debts. She warned Anne that when personal affection is allowed to dictate the distribution of Crown assets, the integrity of the monarchy itself begins to crumble. Then Queen Elizabeth did something extraordinary. She sat down at her writing desk, dictated a short formal memorandum on royal estate governance, and added a single crucial sentence at the bottom in her own distinct handwriting. That handwritten sentence read, no permanent reassignment or exclusive personal conveyance of official Crown residences shall occur without collective consultation and a recorded vote by the Royal Estates Council. The late Queen signed the memorandum, placed it inside a heavy parchment envelope, and handed a certified copy directly to Princess Anne. She instructed Anne to keep that document safe, knowing with the sharp instinct of a monarch who had ruled for 7 decades that a day would come when Charles would try to fulfill the promise he had made at that dinner table. For years, Princess Anne kept that sealed envelope locked inside a private safe at Buckingham Park. She didn't bring it up during the remaining years of her mother's life, and she didn't mention it during the early months of Charles's reign. She waited, quietly watching, as her brother gradually built up the administrative groundwork to hand the residence over to Camilla. And when Anne learned through palace channels that Charles had scheduled a private signing for 4:15 on a quiet Thursday afternoon, she didn't call Charles to argue. She picked up the phone, called Prince William at Kensington Palace, and said 4 simple words: "It is time. Come get the folder." William drove to Gatcombe Park, retrieved his grandmother's handwritten memorandum, and realised he possessed the ultimate constitutional weapon. He wasn't just stepping into that study to stop his father. He was carrying the direct written mandate of Britain's longest reigning monarch. And what Charles had planned to do behind closed doors was about to be exposed to the entire family. Now let's break down the exact scheme that King Charles and his inner circle of private advisors had put together. Because when you look at the paper trail that William's legal team uncovered, the sheer stealth of it was remarkable, and honestly, it came within minutes of succeeding. Back in the early months of the year, a small, highly confidential working group was formed inside Clarence House. The objective was to execute what was internally coded as a sovereign direct conveyance. This legal mechanism was designed to bypass standard institutional oversight by invoking the monarch's ancient royal prerogative over Crown property management. The target property was an exquisite multi-million-pound official Crown residence featuring vast private gardens, historic staterooms, and elite security infrastructure. To ensure the transfer went through without triggering automatic red flags inside Parliament or the Royal Estates Council, Charles's advisors structured the paperwork as an administrative reallocation of household resources, rather than a formal change of title. On paper, it looked like a simple internal management update, but buried inside Clause 14 of the transfer order was the actual payload, an absolute irrevocable lifetime right of occupancy for Queen Camilla, accompanied by a legally binding guarantee that all operational expenses, private security details, structural renovations and estate staff would be funded indefinitely through official Crown allocations. And the budget attached to the immediate private refit was staggering. £4.2 million allocated across 18 months for private structural modifications, customised security perimeters, and luxury interior redesigns. To pull this off without triggering a massive institutional row, the advisors picked a very specific window of time. They scheduled the private signing for a Thursday afternoon, when William was officially logged on the royal calendar as being out of London, attending meetings in Norfolk. They assumed that by the time William returned to Kensington Palace on Friday morning, the executive order would already be signed logged in the official circular and legally irreversible. They counted on the idea that William would be presented with the accomplished fact. They assumed that even if he was furious, he would refrain from causing a massive public scandal by attempting to roll back a signed royal decree. And ask yourself this: why was Camilla so desperate to secure this specific official residence under a permanent legal order? Because behind the luxury and the royal titles, Camilla was living with a deep, persistent sense of personal vulnerability. She understood better than anyone that her public standing and her comfort inside the royal family were entirely dependent on King Charles remaining on the throne. She knew that the moment Charles passed away and William became king, her formal authority inside the palace would evaporate overnight. She was genuinely terrified of being left exposed, relegated to a secondary property, stripped of her elite security detail, and left at the mercy of a stepson who had spent 20 years silently watching her replace his mother. Securing a grand permanent Crown residence under an ironclad legal transfer was her ultimate insurance policy against the future. It was a clever, carefully calculated plan. It accounted for legal loopholes, administrative timing, and financial funding. But it made one catastrophic miscalculation. They completely failed to account for Princess Anne's ironclad loyalty to her mother's memory, and they fundamentally underestimated the cold, uncompromising speed with which Prince William would act when he discovered what was happening behind his back. When William stood in the King's study, with his hand flat over that unsigned transfer order, Charles tried to pull rank. The King stood up behind his desk, his face flushed with anger, and demanded that his son remove his hand immediately. Charles asserted that as sovereign he possessed the sole constitutional authority to allocate royal households as he saw fit, and that William had no legal standing to intervene in a private executive decision. William didn't flinch, and he didn't pull his hand away. Instead, William reached into his suit jacket with his left hand, pulled out the parchment envelope Princess Anne had given him, and laid Queen Elizabeth's handwritten memorandum right beside the transfer order on the desk. William looked his father dead in the eye and said, "You do not have the sole authority, father. Grandmother made sure of that before she died. And if you attempt to sign this paper privately today, I will immediately convene an emergency session of the Royal Estates Council tomorrow morning and present her handwritten mandate directly to the board." Charles looked down at the paper, recognizing his mother's distinct, elegant handwriting instantly. He picked up the memorandum with trembling fingers, read the handwritten sentence, requiring a collective consultation and recorded vote, and slowly sat back down in his chair. The colour completely drained from his face. He realised in that single crushing moment that his sister and his son had completely checkmated him, using the late Queen's own words. The trap had sprung. Charles couldn't sign the document privately, without explicitly violating his mother's documented instructions. And he couldn't hide the dispute because William was fully prepared to force a public vote among the estate trustees. Within less than 24 hours, the emergency session of the Royal Estates Council was convened inside the main conference chamber at Buckingham Palace. The atmosphere inside that room was described as ice cold. Sitting around the long oak table were King Charles, Prince William, Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and senior institutional trustees representing Crown legal and financial affairs. Prince William opened the proceedings. He didn't make an emotional speech about Camilla, and he didn't attack his father personally. He focused strictly on institutional law and financial governance. He presented a detailed breakdown showing that transferring the property permanently to Camilla would impose an unconstitutional financial burden on the Crown, forcing future reigns to fund a private establishment without public or parliamentary oversight. Then Princess Anne opened her folder, read Queen Elizabeth's memorandum, allowed to the council, and formally entered her mother's handwritten mandate into the official record. Charles sat at the head of the table in total helpless silence as one trustee after another nodded in agreement with William and Anne. The legal consensus was absolute and immediate. The private transfer order was constitutionally soundless and could not be approved in its current form. The king was forced to execute a humiliating retreat. He picked up the original transfer order, formally withdrew the proposal from the board, and agreed that no permanent private conveyance of the residence would take place. William had won a total legal victory inside the council chamber. But as news of the internal defeat reached Queen Camilla's private quarters, the personal war within the family was about to reach its absolute breaking point. At 8 o'clock on the morning following the disastrous council meeting, Queen Camilla requested a private one-on-one meeting with Prince William. She explicitly instructed her staff that no private secretaries, no legal advisors, and specifically no King Charles should be present in the room. The meeting took place inside a quiet drawing room at Clarence House. When William entered, he found Camilla standing by the window, looking pale, exhausted, and deeply shaken. There were no formal royal greetings, and there was no polite small talk. Camilla turned to William and asked a single raw question that cut straight through 20 years of polite palace illusions. Did you do this because you genuinely care about estate rules, William, or did you do it simply to humiliate me and remind me that I will never truly belong in this family? That was the moment where the polished veneer of royal duty completely stripped away, leaving pure, unadulterated personal pain on the table. William looked at his stepmother and spoke in a low, incredibly steady voice. He told her that his resistance had never been about personal humiliation or spite. He explained that when a sovereign uses official crown property to settle private emotional obligations, the entire institution loses its moral and legal standing. He told her plainly, "My mother was stripped of her royal standing and her home when she left this family. I will not stand by and watch crown assets that belong to the public and to future generations be handed out to settle old debts. This institution is held in trust, Camilla. It is not a private bank account." The words landed with devastating force. Camilla sat down on a sofa looking completely defeated. She finally admitted to William the deep driving fear that had fueled the entire scheme, her terror of being left homeless, unprotected, and financially marginalised, the moment Charles passed away. And this is where Prince William proved that he is not just a fierce protector of his mother's legacy, but a brilliant, pragmatic strategist. Instead of leaving Camilla ruined and desperate, William offered her a structured, dignified compromise, one that protected both her future and the Crown's institutional integrity. William laid out two binding conditions. First, Camilla would be granted full dignified use security and staffing of the official residence for the duration of King Charles's reign. She would enjoy every comfort and privilege appropriate for a queen consort. But the exact second Charles's reign ended, the property would automatically revert to the unrestricted crown estate, with zero permanent private entitlements attached. Second to answer, her fear of future insecurity. William agreed to support the creation of a privately funded, lifetime housing arrangement for Camilla, secured exclusively through personal royal family funds and private estate resources, meaning not a single penny of public crown property would be permanently tied up. It was a masterclass in visual and legal diplomacy. William didn't drive his stepmother into a corner where she had nothing left to lose. He gave her security, dignity, and comfort while completely stripping away her ability to privatize crown assets. Camilla sat in silence for a long moment, realized she had no remaining legal or political leverage, and slowly nodded her agreement. The internal terms were set, the compromise was locked. But outside the palace walls, a sudden press leak was about to turn this private family deal into a national media explosion. Less than 48 hours after Camilla accepted William's compromise, a confidential briefing summary from the Royal Estates Council was mysteriously leaked to senior royal correspondents in London. By 7 o'clock on Friday morning, major newspaper headlines across the country flashed the news: Prince William blocks royal home deal. Front-page articles detailed how the Prince of Wales had stepped in to prevent a multi-million-pound crown property from being permanently reassigned, sparking an intense national debate over royal spending, estate, governance, and family power dynamics. Public opinion split almost instantly. Commentators on live television debated whether William had acted as a cold, disobedient son, humiliating his ailing father, or as a courageous, responsible future king, protecting public resources from royal overreach. Inside Buckingham Palace, the communications team was in total panic, desperately trying to figure out how to manage the narrative without exposing the deep family rift to the entire world. And then came the scheduled public event that would test the family's unity in front of dozens of international news cameras. A grand state reception at Buckingham Palace, attended by foreign ambassadors, government ministers, and elite society figures. The press gallery was packed behind the velvet ropes, expecting visible tension, cold body language, or awkward distances between the King, the Queen, and the Prince of Wales. Queen Camilla arrived first, walking beside King Charles into the main reception hall. She wore a striking sapphire gown and maintained an absolute flawless mask of royal composure. But insiders noted that Charles looked visibly drained, his expression tight and anxious, as he scanned the room. Then Prince William and Princess Catherine stepped into the hall. As the cameras flashed continuously, King Charles did something that caught every seasoned royal reporter completely off guard. Instead of maintaining a distant, formal posture, Charles stopped near the centre of the room, turned around, looked directly at William, and made a warm, deliberate hand gesture, inviting his son to step up and stand directly beside him at the front of the receiving line. William paused for a fraction of a second, then stepped forward, taking his place shoulder to shoulder with his father and Camilla in front of the world's media. The visual statement was devastatingly powerful. Without a single word spoken to the press, without a single official statement issued by Clarence House, that 90-second visual interaction communicated everything. It signaled to the entire nation that while a fierce institutional battle had been fought behind closed doors, the hierarchy of the monarchy remained completely intact. Charles had publicly acknowledged his heir's standing, accepted the constitutional boundary his son had enforced, and demonstrated that the future of the crown was secure. Reporters in the room described the subtle energy shift instantly. The story was no longer about a chaotic family collapse. It was about a mature, disciplined institution, processing its internal friction with dignity and absolute strength. The public message was total. But behind the scenes, the physical work of dismantling Camilla's grand renovation scheme was about to begin. The morning following the state reception, the administrative machinery inside the royal estate went into full reverse gear. Contracts that had been quietly drafted with elite interior design firms and high-end security contractors were officially terminated. Architectural blueprints that detailed private structural modifications to the residence were recalled from planning offices and shredded. The £4.2 million refit budget was quietly cancelled and reallocated back into the general Crown Estate maintenance pool. Staffing appointments that had been arranged to manage Camilla's proposed private establishment were formally reviewed and converted into standard temporary household assignments tied strictly to the sovereign's active reign. Inside Clarence House, the mood was described by courtiers as one of quiet, sombre resignation. Camilla sat at her desk, reviewing the updated operating guidelines issued by the Royal Estates Council. Every single document presented to her now explicitly classified the residence as a temporary working property, removing any trace of the permanent ownership language Charles had promised her months earlier. King Charles walked into her sitting room later that afternoon, sat down across from his wife and delivered a deeply personal, sorrowful apology. He admitted that in his desperate desire to protect her and compensate for the decades of public hostility and rejection she had endured, he had made a promise he never held the constitutional power to fulfill. I looked at her with tired eyes and said, "I wanted to give you absolute certainty, Camilla. I wanted to build a wall around you that nobody could ever tear down. But in trying to protect you, I almost destroyed the very rules that hold this house together." Camilla looked at her husband, took his hand, and gave him a response that proved she understood the reality of their situation. She told him that living with an honest temporary boundary was far better than holding on to a false legal promise that would have caused an explosive public war the moment he was no longer here to defend her. The private dream of an untouchable permanent estate was completely dead. But in its place, a cold, stable reality had been established. Meanwhile, Prince William remained completely silent. He didn't issue press leaks boasting about his victory over Clarence House. He didn't allow Kensington Palace staff to celebrate the council's decision. He treated the entire outcome not as a personal triumph, but as a mandatory routine correction of institutional governance. He had set out to protect the Crown's assets from private overreach, and he had accomplished his objective with surgical, uncompromising precision. And the final action he was about to take would lock that boundary in place for the next century. On the final day of the estate review, the Royal Estates Council officially codified and registered the new Crown Estate Property Charter. This was not just a basic internal policy update. It was a binding, permanent institutional charter signed by King Charles, Prince William, and senior state trustees. Under the explicit terms of the charter, Queen Elizabeth's handwritten memorandum was formally integrated into the permanent governance rules of the British Crown. From that moment forward, no reigning monarch, no royal council, and no private executive order could ever permanently transfer, reassign, or convey an official Crown residence to a consort or private family member without a formal public parliamentary review and a recorded 2/3 majority vote by the council. The loophole Charles had tried to use was permanently welded shut. Days later, Queen Camilla officially entered the residence for the first time under the new operating terms. She didn't enter as a private owner or a permanent title holder. She entered as a temporary custodian, representing the reigning sovereign. In a quiet, dignified gesture that earned immense respect from palace staff, Camilla requested that one of the main historic drawing rooms be dedicated to displaying portraits and artefacts honouring past royal consorts throughout British history. She accepted her role with the disciplined composure she had spent 2 decades perfecting. When senior aides at Kensington Palace asked Prince William if he wanted to release a brief public statement, highlighting his role in establishing the new property charter, William rejected the idea instantly. He looked at his communications team and said 3 simple words: "The boundary stands." No victory laps, no media, interviews, no public drama. Just an airtight legal charter, a protected Crown estate, and a clear, unyielding standard set for future generations. The confrontation that had started with a hand placed over an unsigned document in the King's study was officially over. The residence was safe, the rules were sealed, and the family had survived the storm. But as quiet returned to the corridors of Buckingham Palace, the larger realisation of what this showdown meant for the future of the British monarchy was just beginning to settle over the nation. When you step back from the frantic palace confrontations, the leaked council memos, the cancelled renovation budgets, and the grand state receptions, you realise that we didn't just witness a family argument over who gets the keys to a grand house. We witnessed the official, irreversible arrival of Prince William's era of governance. For years, the public narrative around King Charles's reign was that he would rule as a gentle, traditional bridge between the old Elizabethan age and the modern world, managing complicated domestic relationships with soft compromises and private allowances behind closed doors. But this crisis proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the era of soft compromise is officially dead. Charles still wears the physical crown, sits on the throne during state openings of Parliament, and signs the official state papers. But everyone inside the British establishment now knows that when actual institutional power, long-term strategy, and constitutional boundaries are tested, it is Prince William who holds the real leverage, the unyielding discipline, and the absolute willingness to act, and didn't wait for a parliamentary committee to intervene. He didn't allow courtiers to cover up the deal. He saw a threat to the Crown's long-term integrity, walked into the King's study, put his hand over the pen, and shut the operation down in broad daylight. And think about what this reveals about the kind of king Prince William is going to be. I is not a sentimental leader who will allow personal guilt, family pressure, or old domestic debts to erode the public trust of the monarchy. He proved that he views the crown not as a personal inheritance to be enjoyed or shared among relatives, but as a sacred cold public trust that must be protected at all costs for the generations that come after him. The boy who walked behind his mother's coffin 29 years ago, watching the royal institution navigate one of the darkest crises in its history, has grown into a formidable, hyper-focused leader who understands that the only way the monarchy survives in the modern world is through absolute accountability, iron discipline, and total transparency. On the evening following the codification of the new estate charter, Catherine, Princess of Wales, wrote a quiet reflection in her private personal journal that captured the true weight of what had just taken place. She wrote about watching her husband stand on the balcony of Kensington Palace, looking out over the quiet gardens as the sun set over London. She wrote, "Power in this life is not measured by the titles we wear or the grand houses we inhabit. It is measured by the discipline we show when tempted to treat duty as a private privilege." William did not fight this battle to take something away. He fought it to ensure that what belongs to the nation remains untouched. Personal devotion had been checked before it became permanent royal law, and the crown survived because one future king had the nerve to put his hand over an unsigned page and demand to know if anyone had actually asked permission. The folder is now closed, the transfer order is shredded, the estate charter is sealed in the royal archives, and Queen Camilla continues her duties beside the king in quiet, disciplined grace. The monarchy survived the confrontation, the headlines, and the night, but the message delivered in that quiet study echoes across the entire institution. The future has arrived, and Prince William is already holding the line.